So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, Sonia. She's back. Okay. Hello, welcome. My name is Lily Chen. I'm a fourth year in comparative race and ethnic studies and sociology with a minor in gender and sexuality. I just turned in my last paper, so I think I have a degree, which is good. Thank you. We are really excited to be putting on this panel titled Feminist Analytics, Challenging the Classical Canon. We actually are joined here tonight by some of the coolest panelists. And so down the line, we have Ali Chamje, Daniel Pesca, Barbara Schubert, Stacy Guerra, Clara Lyon, and Doyle Ambrose. Hi, Doyle. Hi. All right, so the way that this is going to work, I'm going to give a brief introduction to kind of our ideas of what feminist analytics are and why we chose to put on a panel with this theme. And then we're going to go down the line and ask each panelist to give a brief introduction, and so we'll get to that then. So this panel is actually part of a series of panels that CMO puts on annually that is kind of focused on decolonizing and democratizing classical music, which we kind of understand to be sometimes a very white and male-dominated world, if you have any experience in it. And so part of the questions that we want to ask in each of these panel series is, not only what can we do, but what does it mean to look critically at the space of classical music? So the question of feminist analytics is basically I'm going to kind of use the forms of analysis that feminists have presented, mostly American feminists, over kind of the past 2 centuries. And so I'm just going to tell you some of them to kind of get you familiar. These are actually things that you should be very familiar with. So for example, right, politicizing the unpolitical, or the places that we don't necessarily recognize as political, for example, right, Brahms or Beethoven or chamber music or classical music, and kind of locating where the politics are and how they play out in the space of classical music. Feminist analytics are also famous for kind of focusing on the body and body politics, asking questions like, for example, with orchestra music, right, who is on stage and where are they on stage, right? Where are we seeing women on stage? Where are we seeing men on stage? And perhaps where are we not seeing women on stage? Another major kind of feminist intervention in the last century, actually last century and a half, was intersectionality. And this is, of course, the kind of combined analyses of multiple structures of oppression. And so we're looking at, for example, race, gender, class, sexuality, and et cetera. When it comes to classical music, I think this could not be more obvious. And so, for example, if we're looking at the stage at our CSO, we only have one black musician on stage, and he is also a trumpet player. And we have Asian female players that populate the violin section and yet cannot be seen in any of the other sections. Bass sections, of course, are dominated by white males. So kind of asking the combined question of what it means to be both a person of color or a woman of color on the stage. And another major one is the politics of femininity and masculinity. So these are kind of broader topics of what kind of behaviors or what kind of themes are considered legitimate in the classical music sphere. And so is a dominating or more masculine kind of behaviors or subjects more easily recognized in the sphere of classical music. And then finally, what we're here for today, mostly the politics of recognition and building the canon. So, where are women in the canon? Are women not recognized? Or do they not structurally have the opportunity to flourish in the way that men did? Or is it that we're refusing to recognize the other avenues in which women are flourishing in classical music? Okay, so those are just some of our preliminary questions to kind of get us in the right realm. And I'm going to actually begin by asking everyone to introduce themselves. So if you can tell us what kind of made you interested in participating in this panel and what comes to mind when you're thinking about something like gender and classical music. And throughout the panel, we're really interested in hearing both your personal experiences and your own reflections on any of these topics. Okay, so we can start with Ali.
Okay, hello. My name is Alican Çamcı. I'm a composer and a PhD student in the University of Chicago. I'm from Turkey originally, so that's, I think, about me. And the other question was?
What drew you to the panel?
Yeah, actually, I have to confess, when I got the email from Shirley about participating in this, I was very honored, but also a little bit, or not a little bit, quite intimidated, because I don't really know, or I didn't know whether I can convey something meaningfully to the audience here. But yeah, seeing the questions and everything, I'm really looking forward to learning from the people. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Daniel Pesca. I'm the director of the Chamber Music program here at the University of Chicago and an artist in residence in the Department of Music. And I am trained as a pianist and as a composer, and have been part of many institutions, many organizations, have attended many festivals for contemporary music and so forth, especially, which is sort of my area of focus. And I've noticed in a lot of these environments a great deal of gender equality. As I was reflecting upon this panel, I thought of my time at the Aspen Music Festival some years ago. I was in the contemporary ensemble. I was the pianist for the contemporary ensemble there for 2 summers. And during those 2 summers, there were no female members of the composition faculty. We didn't play any works by female composers, and even within the ensemble, we only had 1 female member over the 2 years I played. So I suppose I'm coming at this as a new music person, who's very involved in the new music community in a variety of ways, and I note, even in a community that sort of prides itself on being rather progressive in many ways, there still are many environments where there's a lot of inequality. In other respects, I'll say that like Ali, I feel like I have a lot to learn, and I'm very eager to listen to the experience of the other panelists.
I'm Barbara Schubert. I'm the conductor of the University Symphony Orchestra and New Music Ensemble and director of performance programs here. I started my own conducting career really in college, and that was many decades ago. And so this is a topic that's been a part of my life for the whole time I've been involved. When I was in college, there were no role models at all, no female orchestral conductors really at any level. I will tell you that I went to a women's college. I went to Smith, which is the college of Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan, and so that gives you a little bit of an insight into the empowerment of women. I do think that had I not gone to Smith College, I would not have ended up as a conductor, because I am sure that I wouldn't have had the very rich, encouraging opportunities at another school. That was a time when most of the Ivies were first going co-ed, and women definitely did not have equal opportunities at the Ivies at those stages. In any case, I've had my share of horror stories, certainly in the field where, people say, well, why is she a conductor when there's no word for a female maestro? And where I've had search committees say to me, we don't think our audience is ready for the idea of a woman conductor, and things like that. In many ways, I've sort of almost ignored the issue and just tried to concentrate on being the best conductor I can and making music and being really serious about that. On the other hand, I think that there has been progress made in the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years. Now there are way more women working in the field of conducting. Now we'll talk about that later, I'm sure, because there are many glass ceilings that haven't been broken. And those women, or most of them, are, teaching high school orchestras. But, when I was a kid, there weren't even women conductors of high school orchestras, so it is different. I look forward to the day that perhaps a woman conductor is not a different category, that we're just all conductors evaluated for what is our talent and our vision and our commitment to music making, I do think that that day is a very, very long way off, and that relates to other societal issues that perhaps we'll talk about. So it's an enormously complex issue that I've lived with for many, many years, and I look forward to more dialogue about it with you and with the other panelists.
Hi, I'm Stacy Garup, and I actually got my master's here. I worked with Barbara Schubert many years ago, 1993 through 95. One of the reasons I actually came to this school was because of Shulamit Ron. And at that time, where I came from, University of Michigan, there were no women composers on the faculty or theorists. So I wanted a chance to study with a female composer. And since then, I went on to Indiana University and got my doctorate, and I taught at Roosevelt University for 16 years. Now I'm a freelance composer. But it really has been an issue all my life, being a female composer. There's no way around it. A lot of times I do try to actually brush it under the carpet and just say I'm a composer. And I don't want to make a big deal of the fact that I'm female. And that, for me, is why it's interesting to be taking part on this panel, because it's something I have kind of avoided but yet had to deal with the entire time of my career.
Hi, my name is Clara Lyon. I'm a violinist and a member of the Spectral Quartet, which is the ensemble in residence here at University of Chicago. When I was asked to be a part of the panel and I was sort of reflecting on my own life as a performer, there were two things that I think really struck me and that made me inspired to be a part of the panel today. One is that in my capacity as a violinist with Spectral Quartet, we play a lot of new music, and I do have the opportunity to influence our programming a great deal. And so it's thinking about trying to balance the importance of gender equality in the works that we perform is something that I do think about a good deal. And the other thing that I was reflecting on is in my own life as a performer, before Spectral Quartet, before college even, I started thinking about who my role models were as a performer and started realizing that when I was little and just kind of starting to play the violin and becoming interested in being a serious musician, there weren't even that many women soloists. I didn't have recordings of that many women violinists, and the ones that I did have, and Sophie Mutter, for example, who's a tremendous, tremendous violinist. There was no role model for me that was not also sexualized in some way in marketing. So that's something, I don't know, just something that I noticed and something that I find important to talk about.
Hi, I'm Doyle Armbrust. I'm violist for Spectral Quartet. I was surprised to be asked because this might come as a surprise to many of you, but I'm a white male. But as Clara mentioned, because we're a group that's not locked into the quote-unquote canon, it's a word I find really problematic. But in any case, because we're not just playing traditional music, which is, by and large, music by men, we do have an opportunity to make change for the better, and so it is something that we think actively about. We're also a quartet that went through 2 personnel changes, and so it was something that we got to think about in terms of the people that we invited to come audition for us. In terms of background, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and that was a time when things like the Vienna Phil admitting its first female performer was a thing. And so I feel like my experience growing up was different than it is now. Now I think it largely in terms of programming, but back then it was even something in terms of performers. So for me, it's been a journey of realizing blind spots, of recognizing where this is happening and in what way. And so I'm grateful to play in a group where we get to sort of identify those blind spots and have conversations like this one to hopefully move things in a better direction.
Thank you very much. So before we kind of get started with our questions, I also want to note, today we are really proud to be centering some of our very accomplished women in the music community, and we also are very proud to welcome men to our to our panel. I think because a lot of times in conversations about gender, right, men go unmarked, so they can get away with being ungendered and unburdened with these kind of politics, when in fact, actually, right, men are part of the system, the same system of gender inequity that kind of permeates the classical music community. So I think, and also men also play a big role, I think, in to kind of channel Emma Watson, right, like kind of stand by the feminist project and to think about what it would mean to include women composers and women conductors into their kind of work. Okay, so I want to actually begin by turning to Barbara and Stacy and Clara, and the three of you are actually in like very different fields, and so as young student musicians, I think in these different fields, right, as in composition and conducting, and as kind of semi-pre-professional musicians, we kind of encounter the system of classical music in very different ways, and I'm sure that you have as well. And so if you can speak to, as musicians in these different fields, if you can speak to kind of your own experience and how it might differ as a conductor, as a composer, as a violinist. And actually, I'm also very interested in the idea of the sexualized role model, and we did talk a lot about the role models that we have. And I think you're completely right. I mean, all of my female role models are also, right, always in skin-tight dresses and always presented in a certain way. So if you guys can speak to your particular fields and how they kind of intersect with gender.
Who wants to start?
I will.
Okay, great.
One of the reasons I studied with Shulamit Ron is because of the way she looked. And there's a story to this. I was auditioning for colleges, and I was targeting schools with female composers because I wanted to know, did it make a difference to study with a woman? And I went to one school, which I won't name, and I met a faculty member who was female, and it looked like she was trying to basically fade into her office. She was wearing a gray suit. Her office was gray. Her hair was nondescript. It could be she was just non-visual, and that's totally fine. But then I met Shulamit, and her hair was huge and curly, and she was wearing this dress that was red and hot pink, and she was probably about 7 or 8 months pregnant at that point. And she was also the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and composer in residence of the CSO and the Lyric, and it looked like here is a role model that had everything. You know, she could look like a female, she could have children, she could accomplish all these things. And that for me was, on some level, the picture is what completed it for me, and saying, okay, this is the one that I want to be, this is the person I want to follow. I don't know if that makes a difference or not in the end. I think the fact if you work hard, if you work very, very hard, you can achieve what you want. The thing that I feel that perhaps was the biggest problem being female, especially at University of Michigan, was of the three the worst in terms of women being discriminated against, is not so much the stuff that I knew what was happening, but the stuff that I wasn't invited to take part in. And so I would hear about how the male students would go out with the professors for a beer or go over to their house for dinner or whatever, and I never got any of those invites. And it was a matter of, well, is it because they see me and they think, oh, she's not going to be serious about this? And the biggest story of all, and then I'll hand over the microphone to the next, and this is where I felt like, okay, I don't want the future generations to go through this, is I had finished my sophomore year of lessons, and I had loved my teacher. I thought he was wonderful, and so I asked if he had any feedback for me. And he said, this is a great career for you to have, because when you get married and have kids, you can do this on the side. And that was the first time I looked at him and thought, he really didn't see me at all this semester, or this whole year, did he? He really thought I was just in this because I want to have a family someday. Maybe I do, maybe I don't, but how do I know in my sophomore year? And I hoped over the past generations that has changed, and some of the stories that have been surfacing on Facebook is proving otherwise, that some women are still putting up with some stuff. But I do hope that as generations do retire and new faculty comes in, that hopefully these perspectives will shift.
Well, you mentioned the whole issue of how one looks and how one presents themselves, and I think maybe we should dive into that right now because we can't get away from it. In the world of music, which is commercialized to an extent that perhaps we all wish it weren't, the image of the beautiful soloist or the strikingly attractive maestro is something that really dominates marketing for music at all kind of levels. I think that certainly Shulamit first and foremost is a superb composer and a woman of integrity and got everything she deserves because of that tremendous talent. Certainly, it also helped her that she's beautiful. It's undeniable that it helps it that she's beautiful, and it's undeniable that it helps, say, opera singers who are beautiful. Anna Netrebko, is gorgeous, and that certainly has helped launch her career. You'll see postings that say, well, she only looks good and she has a terrible voice and all this kind of stuff. So it gets very, very complex. But in music, you can't get away from the fact that we live in such a visually oriented and commercial society that sometimes promotes talent as well, but maybe sometimes exaggerates other aspects of what a person's persona is. I just like to add two things about the fact that this is, I think, even more complex for a woman conductor than it is for, say, a violin soloist who wears, can wear a beautiful gown and, bare and slinky and whatnot, or an opera singer or a soloist on stage. A woman conductor has to decide. The first thing is, okay, do you wear a tuxedo? Certainly I decided I never wore a tuxedo, even though that's what the first women conductors were wearing, in part because I'm 6 feet tall and sort of thin, and so the idea if I wore a tuxedo, I felt that I would be accused of trying to look like a man or trying to be a man or, quote, denying my femininity. On the other hand, you don't want to wear a bare, flouncy dress by any means because you need to be able to move. So the question of even what you wear as a woman conductor is an issue. What does a man wear on the podium? Tails, no issue, right? Nothing to decide. You wear tails, that's the expectation. I have concert reviews where instead of talking, the first thing about the sound of the orchestra is, what she was wearing. And, that's really demeaning by all means. And another thing that's interesting, and this gets into not only what you look like, but issues of, shall we say, power and authority, quote unquote. Most of the women, the first women who were really successful in professional conducting were all very short, like 5 feet tall. And, that could be a coincidence, but on the other hand, it might, there might be some issues there too about how men, especially in professional realm, look at an authority figure and can they deal with a woman who's 5 feet tall and there's something else they feel when the woman is 6 feet tall. So again, it's very complex. I'm not saying that this is, the one factor, but it is a factor.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. As I was sort of mentioning before, trying to think back on my own role models as a kid growing up being a serious musician. I have to say, two things. I feel extremely lucky that my parents were both musicians as well. My parents are serious professional musicians, and although I didn't have musicians that I could go see necessarily who were not wearing these ball gowns, my parents did expose me to a lot of musicians of the past, and a lot of whom were female. And it was a funny thing to get to college and be taking a music history class and realize that maybe the one page, literally 1 or 2 pages in an entire 1,000-page textbook says anything about women at all. And maybe it says something like Fanny Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann were female composers, they were as talented as their male counterparts, but weren't given the resources to succeed, so they didn't. I find that like a really troubling line, because not only is not a lot of space in our music history taken up by sharing the creative output of women, but hearing that as a student, it really puts the onus on you, I guess, to go and search out more information. But when there's so much time being spent talking about other white male musicians and composers, you'd think that there would be a little bit more to say. And I think one other thing that I have noticed is that I think when we talk about gender in music from a historical standpoint, we almost always talk about composers, and that's the way that history books are written as well. But there were quite a number of important women performers, and I think performers in general kind of tend to get shut out of our music history books. And so it was just something I was thinking about, and thinking if that wouldn't be a way to help kind of include and empower through historical knowledge younger students.
Thank you. I have so many feelings. But I want to ask everyone, so to kind of continue on the question of, right, the music textbook or the idea of the canon that Doyle dislikes, if you guys can actually, and anyone can jump in, speak to the idea of a canon, right, and what a canon is made of, and what are the problematics of a canon, and then what maybe is necessary about a canon, and what our canons kind of look like. And anyone is welcome. Doyle, actually, I'm really curious how you would approach the question, the term canon, yeah.
I think a canon is inertia, which I think classical music is really good at. Traditional classical music, and those that like our CSO or our lyric opera, who are just absurdly bad about their programming breadth of what they do. They're obviously amazing at what they do, but it's so limited. But it's a perpetual story that we keep telling ourselves. So there's music that's amazing, and I think undeniably amazing, that the majority of people would agree, yes, this is an incredible piece of music. But if we keep calling the same groups of pieces the canon, it just enters our lexicon, it enters our minds as that being true, and when we're of a certain age and impressionable, we just take that for granted, and then we have to go about unlearning that later on in life. So I also just sort of, so anyway, I think it's a story that we tell ourselves, but also limiting it to the same sort of list of pieces, I just think is boring. Like, I don't find an interest there. Like, it's that's why I play in a group that plays a lot of different kinds of music, simply because that's what keeps me artistically inspired. But anyway, I don't think it's problematic to have pieces that we look up to, or composers that we look up to, or people that did it really well. I think we have to consider the context in which they thrived, which is part of what we're talking about today. But I feel like if we keep using that word, then it's going to self-perpetuate.
And everyone else, if you were ever part of kind of programming or those kind of decisions, what Barbara, for example, like how are you going about making those decisions when it comes to the canon?
Well, again, I think it's enormously complex, because I am an orchestral conductor, and most orchestral music is Western European or American. There's just no way around it there. And So there are pillars of that repertoire. We're performing one of the pillars of that repertoire this weekend. And people may say that it's done too often or that there's nothing new to be learned, but I happen to think there's a tremendous amount to be learned from restudying the Beethoven Ninth, from bringing it to people in different contexts and so forth. So I think that there are certain things, just like Shakespeare shouldn't be ignored, Michelangelo shouldn't be denigrated, Plato should be respected, those sorts of things. I think there are people and pieces that are part of a tradition that a well-educated person in our society should know. Now, that doesn't mean that's all they should know by any means. I do try very hard to to mix up the familiar with the unfamiliar. I think those of you who play in the symphony know that this year that there was, a number of pieces that perhaps nobody had ever heard of before, and, that we were able to bring to the audience and so forth. I certainly I'm not nearly as adventurous as the spectral quartet is in what I bring to the orchestral realm. And that's part because I feel like it's in part my obligation to, now this is going to sound contradictory. It's in part my obligation to teach the canon as an orchestral conductor at a university. I try, as I say, to go beyond that. A sort of addendum when people who play in the orchestra know that I also ask people for their input about what repertoire they want. And it's very surprising. I get the preponderance of suggestions are for really, really familiar war horses. Really, really familiar war horses. And then occasionally, maybe out of all the suggestions I get, there might be one or two pieces I've never heard of, or one or two pieces that I've never performed. But the preponderance is for wanting to redo the same thing. So that's sort of emphasizing the complexity of what you're talking about, that we keep redoing the same thing and we need to broaden it. So I feel the obligations in both ways.
Can I jump in with something interesting happened on Facebook in the past week. I was working on parts for a piece. So you have time to think about other pieces and listen to music. So I threw on Facebook to wind ensemble conductors, what are some pieces you'd recommend to listen to? And after about the first 24 hours of recommendations coming in, which you'd say is maybe their canon, they were all male. Every single piece that was listed was male. And there was one piece that was a transcription written by a female that was on that list. And I thought, should I say anything or not? And I thought, well, I'm still making parts, so I still have time. So yeah, let me think of a way to phrase this. So I said, thank you everyone for posting, but I can't help but notice that all the pieces were male. Does anyone have any female suggestions? And it was actually quite scary to hit the post button, because I do not want to be really labeled as the feminist composer that's aiming to only have works programmed by women. But what happened next got very interesting. There was at least 60 responses that came in, and suddenly everybody couldn't stop naming pieces. It's like now that I had drawn the spotlight to this particular area.
But they didn't name them to begin with.
Right.
So that's another level of that we need to consider.
One of the problems with that, I think, is really about the way that the wind ensemble itself, the repertoire is formed. The fact that it comes out of the military bands, and who was playing in the bands, and who wrote for those bands, and how old is this history anyway compared to that of Beethoven and Haydn. And then and people were saying Granger and all these really wonderful old composers. So once the spotlight got moved to more recent and female composers, suddenly there was a huge amount done. What happened next is Cynthia Turner, who's a conductor, one of the few wind ensemble conductors, said, Stacy, do you want to put a list together? And I'm like, no, I'm drowning in parts. And Christian Michael Folk, a young conductor, actually stepped up and made the list. So 24 hours later, we now have a GDocs list of all works by female wind ensemble composers, and he made an accompanying YouTube track, and it got shared, I think, over 200 times. So I think we can create canons. We just need to figure out where the holes are and then put a spotlight onto that.
Yeah, if I can emphasize that point a little bit. In what Doyle and I do in Spectral Quartet, I think we think very actively about issues of diversity and gender equality. It's definitely something we have talked a lot about in planning our future seasons. And it is problematic because we do play historical music as well, because we play music of the past. And so there is, and just to own up to it and say out loud, there's a lot of music by dead white men that I love and that I really want to play. Because it's good music. And I think the key is also saying, well, how do we go forward? Obviously, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. I don't know if this will happen, but something that we have talked about doing is like, what if we did an entire season of pieces by women composers, and didn't say anything about it? This to me is, I think sometimes, particularly in the new music field, there is such a kind of like a rally cry for voices, more voices of women, and a more feminist approach and a more feminist take. And sometimes, to me, it hits the wrong nerve. Occasionally, I think, when it is spotlit in such a way that that also becomes a way to further alienate and further kind of group things together. So, for example, if I'm programming, I don't necessarily want, and I'm not necessarily interested in programming a concert that is called like Celebrating Women Composers.
I would
Because
totally agree with you on that one.
Well, it gets ghettoized, which just like, in February, everybody does music by black composers, and they don't do it the rest of the year. Black History Month, you do black composer. All the African-American conductors get a lot of work in February, and then they starve the rest of the year. I mean, it's another symbol.
Yeah, I think it's important to put those programs together and then stand behind them and believe in them always, and not to use that, I guess, as a crutch for marketing.
These are, I think, really interesting concepts, and I think when we're also thinking about what it means to love a canon and love the dead white men that have kind of been part of our careers growing up, I think there are also ways to think about canon, not in terms of just who's on the page and who's writing, but how we put that music forth. And I think for a lot of USO players, it is significant to do Beethoven 9 with a female conductor, right? And it's something that could not have been imagined in a different time. And so just to kind of approach the canon in this kind of multifaceted way, I think is really important.
Can I just tell you that once at a conducting workshop, I did have another conductor colleague say that a woman should never conduct Beethoven because a woman can't feel the things that a man can feel, and so therefore I should never conduct Beethoven. And that really did happen. I'm not making it up.
We're really excited to be putting on Beethoven.
Me too.
Yes. And okay, so I want to ask some of the kind of younger. Everyone's young. Just kidding. Sorry. So sorry. But I mean, okay, so newly coming into the scene, right, or being part of something like new music, especially Daniel, especially Ali, who is still a graduate student. What that scene kind of looks like. What are the politics, and what are people kind of supporting, and then where does it fall through? And not only where does it fall through, but where are the possible openings and the possible potentials that you see in kind of approaching the issues that you maybe come across.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I think institutions and organizations are all kind of developing at their own rates. There's a huge range that I've seen in my experience of different kinds of approaches out there, and I think regionally there are huge differences as well. I think from what I've only been here at the university for a year, but from what I've seen of this place, it's pretty remarkable, I think, in its awareness of these issues, and that the community seems really tuned into it. I recently was a guest teacher at a liberal arts college, and I was teaching composition, and it was a department of 20 composers, and there was one woman in the department. She was my student. Neither of the faculty, we were both male. And just like, I talked to her about it in several lessons. It came up in several lessons, and I was very sensitive about the music I showed her. I didn't show her pieces by female composers saying, oh, look, this is a piece by a female composer. But I was sure to show her through that, through my kind of curation of the materials I showed her and the pieces I showed her, that there is a space out there for her, even though her immediate environment isn't giving her necessarily that space and that reinforcement. I think the question was about how things are changing. So the answer I'm suggesting here is that things are changing unevenly. And as we enter different environments, especially those of us who are white males, I think we want to be sensitive to the dynamics of those environments and the needs of the people in those environments. And I know I have a lot of work to do in this regard myself, and it's work, you know, I look forward to.
Yeah, I completely agree with Daniel, and I wanted to actually, like, I think this is going to, okay. One thing that I wanted to add is, it seems like in experimental music or new music, the stakes seem a little bit lower in comparison to maybe more like strictly canonical mediums like orchestra, chamber music. And there's like a perhaps seemingly more progressive stand, but I think in reality we see similar problems that are being perpetrated in, you know, very intimate scenes of experimental music or new music shows too. There's a very good magazine that is published online. I think the editors are based in Chicago, called Cacophony Magazine, and they have been publishing quite interesting statistics and things about it, so I encourage you to check that out. Another thing that I wanted to pick up on was something that Clara said, and this is the fact that classical music, but also I think still new music, is a culture that is centered on composer and work, and this is a model that I still think very much reinstates similar power dynamics, whereas perhaps an alternative practice that shifts the attention to a more performative situation might improve things a little bit more structurally. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, Ali, you made me think of something really specific in terms of how groups are structured or how they behave. When our quartet, to do what we do, we had to give up all of our freelance life, or the vast majority of it, and that meant walking away from income to make this leap into doing something that we were going to do full time. And I think there's a really big difference between a group, no matter how enthusiastic they are, that do this sort of as a side project that they don't expect to have any income from, and a group that is doing it as their full-time job. So for us, we have to exist in a world in which, when we program at Constellation, we can do whatever the hell we please. And that's 100% on us. Whether you like our programming or not, you know that program is coming from us. Actually, anything that we play, but specifically those concerts, like, we have carte blanche. When we go play for a presenter out of town, we can tell you many, many, many stories about presenters that shut us down on certain kinds of programming. And if we want, this is not trying to, you know, give ourselves a pass here, I just want to point out how this gets complicated, that if we want to go play X series because they can pay us the kind of money that will allow us to pay our rent for the month, then we might, you know, we're still going to be playing music that we love, but maybe it's not quite the spectrum of different eras of music that we particularly like to play. It won't be as wide or something like that. And so it again comes back to something that Barbara said about kind of the fact that this ultimately is a commercial medium and we live in a capitalistic society. Like, if we are going to make a living doing this, there is this negotiation kind of that happens where like you have to take the opportunities you can, and we definitely do push certain presenters and like, you know, okay, just let us do this one little piece, you know, let us have this one thing in there just to kind of, we promise it won't be scary to the audience, whatever it is. And sort of, Obama had that great quote about sort of steering the country, that it's like a battleship, and you know, change comes with these like very incremental movements, right? And when we exist in the sort of presented concert sphere, I feel like that's what we're dealing with, is trying to make small changes. And then when it comes to the things that we have that we just know we're not going to make any money doing or are not depending on that, then we get to do whatever it is that we please.
That's certainly true. As a composer, I learned that early on, especially with quartets. I worked a lot with the Biava Quartet, and there were so many presenters that would just shut them down from playing a new piece of music. So it's built into some structures like saxophone quartets. All their stuff is more recent because the genre is recent. Or wind ensemble, because it's a more recent genre.
Okay, thank you. These are I think, really interesting questions that we didn't even kind of think about when we were programming this panel. I want to kind of return back to the story that Daniel was telling. So he brings up, right, the issue of pedagogy. And I think we have spoken about some of our mentors, and actually, I think this entire panel all teaches students, and your students are here. And I have been a longtime student of actually multiple people on this panel, and Ali was my TA for music theory that I failed. But I think if you guys can speak to the kind of, what does it mean to do pedagogy in a way that is critical, in a way that kind of does the work that you want to see in the future, and also what it means for you, what is like for you to come up. And maybe we can approach it with one of the kind of more fun questions that my team really wanted to know, which was, right, who are your favorite role models? Who are the people that you look up to? Because we always want to learn from you. Yeah. Maybe we can go down the line.
Can we start over there?
I think, I think just the idea of role model is almost the idea of a role model for what we're doing right now is difficult, because to some extent there are none. I mean, there are people we admire, there are people that have had, for me, a tremendous influence in my life, but in many cases it's been both good and bad in the same person, and that makes it complex. I think to say that somebody that I sort of universally admire, I'm not sure I could do that. That somebody that I know personally that I universally admire. I mean, there's certainly conductors and whom I respect tremendously, but don't know. Maybe I don't know them personally, and thus don't know whether I would ascribe to their attitudes. There might be attitudes in there that I don't respect. So I'm being evasive deliberately.
I think that for me, especially because I'm at this point where I went freelance a year ago, I'm looking at the freelancers out there. So Jennifer Higdon, Alex Shapiro, Jim Stevenson, who is male, white male, but a very good white male. And he was a trumpet player. He was a trumpet player for the first 17 years of his professional existence, and he became a composer along the way. So he took the leap, interestingly, from having done no composition to being a trumpet player in an orchestra to, so I'm looking at those people. How are they crafting their careers to pull this thing off where you can be full-time freelance? The other thing I would mention is that there are some really good resources out there for people that are looking for potential role models or just wanting to see women and men shared equally on the page. One of them is called The Muse That Sings by Anne McCutcheon. And this is where you get to be a fly on the wall for about 19 or 20 composers, and they talk all about their compositional process and their wishes and dreams and their, what scares them when they sit down in that room. And a lot of women are in there. So for me, it was the first time reading about the thoughts of Joan Tower or Chen Yi. I think Chen Yi's in there? Yes. The other book that's good, it's more recent, is called Composition in the Digital Age, and it's by Robert Raines. And that one has even more people and a wider age range, and people like Pamela Z are in there who are very non-traditional composers. There's also people like Pauline Oliveros and Meredith Monk that you can look at too to see what can we learn. They may not be top role models for me, I'm certainly nothing like them, but I've looked to see what kind of individual paths they've carved out.
I have 3 short thoughts. One, one is that when I'm trying to think of a personal role model, it is complicated. I'll just echo Barbara's point that for me, for what it is that I specifically do, which is try to play a lot of historically informed music, and then also try to play a lot of the most adventurous, brand new music that there is, there actually just aren't that many performers who are really doing that in the way that I would like to see. But I think in terms of looking at someone who really stands behind their art and I think like does not compromise for issues of marketing and publicity, someone who I admire a lot of what they do. I'll just throw out the name Claire Chase. I think she's amazing. I think her commitment to high-level performance, to breaking down these walls of what the canon is and trying to maybe build a new canon. I don't know someone who is as energetic and as fiercely devoted with really like so much capacity as she is. So she's definitely been a real role model for me. And I'll just throw out one other like very small thought, which is that as a musician, if you are a performer or a student of music performance, I think it is really important to at some point in your life study with someone who looks a little bit like you in terms of what your body looks like. I will say it was extremely important for me to have been able to have female teachers. I also studied with 2 men who were amazing, great teachers, but they play the violin in a completely different way. And anything that they might have to say about setup, only bits and pieces of that applied to me because I am just shaped in such a different way. So that's just a really specific thing to say, but I think it's important.
I think I get off easy on the role model thing because the 2 best violists in the entire world are Tabea Zimmerman and Kim Kashkashian, and I want to be both of them when I grow up. So that one's easy. Violists have it easy. To take maybe your question in a slightly different way, I think there was a realization that I had, I think it was 3 years ago, that all of a sudden we weren't like the new quartet on the block, you know, or the young new music ensemble in Chicago any longer. And I made that realization because people kept sending emails like, how do I do this? How do I do that? You seem to know what you're doing. And that was a really weird experience. I was like, not really. But in realizing whether you like it or not, that people are going to look at what you're doing and say, you know, I want to do that, that the way that we choose to program or the way that we are on stage or any of those elements are really important because now all of a sudden we're not some scrappy upstart. You know, we're somebody that some couple of people are looking up to and may emulate. And so that, you know, for our programming that we have to, you know, we're still going to always choose the music that inspires us and that we want to play, but it is a conscious consideration that, you know, my wife, who's a playwright, said this way better than I ever could, which is that your programming is your mission statement. I'm sure she's not the first to say that, but she said it in a way that totally rang true for me. And just that, to be conscious of that fact that people are going to be looking at what you're programming, and if they see you as successful or good at what you do or whatever it is, that, you know, they're going to be emulating what you're putting out there, and so perhaps that should be taken under advisement.
Can I add something very quick to this? I think also there's like a particular tension that arises from the fact that I think most of us in this panel are not part of the canon in terms of the work we produce or like work we perform. I certainly don't really feel that much. So I feel like canon, both in like literature and music, it's a very specific thing, 30, 40 literary works or like 10 composers. And it seems to me that in the absence of like living canon like this, something that becomes quite important is the notion of community. Especially in Chicago, I think it's a very important scene and a community for new music, and this idea that certain people look up to you, but it's not necessarily like a hierarchical or like a pedagogical situation where they're like learning how to make music from you. But it's a much more, I feel like, affective situation that's happening. So I just wanted to note that there seems to be a little bit of difference between, I feel like, what we do and what happens in CSO or something.
The real world, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. When I think of the role models I've had in music, I had one piano teacher who I studied with for about 7 years of my education named Nalita True. She teaches at the Eastman School of Music, and she is a remarkable person, and my teaching, I think, is incredibly indebted to hers. And when I think of how she was able to hold her students to such a high standard and also be extremely kind and positive, always in her language, I still marvel at it, and I now wish, now that I'm doing much more teaching myself, that I could go back and see how she was achieving that. And a lot of it is simply through the strength of her personality and the strength of her character. I think perhaps relevant to this conversation as well is that she was lucky to have a very supportive husband who was open to her pursuing her career to its fullest extent. I think it's hard to have a conversation about gender that leaves out of the equation the sorts of relationships that our society upholds, and the way that those relationships and familial structures are hierarchical, and how there are expectations on a very interpersonal level. Ms. True speaks about this very openly, how her husband, who was also a pianist, he passed away recently, was incredibly giving. And I think that's been traditionally, looking at the history of music, one of the big sources of tension in the canon, and the lack of female voices in the canon really it comes down to the domestic relationships. And so I found that really lovely, how she expressed that gratitude, but also, like, it wasn't just gratitude, it was also sort of her, like, modeling, like finding relationships, finding structures for yourself, especially for the young women in her studio, that will support your art, and that will support you, and that will nourish you. And that's something I give a lot of thought to myself as well.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel, on these points. I think it's difficult. It's difficult to theorize the role of men when it comes to something like a feminist project, but it has to be done. I want to actually turn in a different direction and to kind of center the question of intersectionality. I'm a woman of color violinist, and I have Midori, and I don't know who else. And I think I kind of want to center these questions in two senses. So one, in kind of your own experience, how are you kind of encountering questions of race at simultaneously with questions of gender? How are you kind of dealing with, in many cases on the panel, like your whiteness, right? And the whiteness that is kind of prevalent and permeates classical music. And feels very, very visceral for any musician, whether it's a composer, a conductor, or a chamber music musician. I think it's very, very visceral when I'm here on campus, and the only available teachers that I have, or the only possible ways that I can go is to have white teachers. And if you can speak to that. The other sense, I think, also, we as a organization, we are constantly asking this question of like, we love music, and we love classical music, and we love chamber music, and also at the same time, people are dying, and there's a whole politics of the world that exists, and we also sit in rooms and play chamber music, and we as students, I think, struggle with this question of like, what does it mean to find joy and find these places of joy while those things are happening, and what would it mean to think about those things simultaneously, right? To think about, to be a supporter of something like Black Lives Matter, and then also do chamber music and do something that is marked by white, male, upper middle class privilege, right? So if you guys can speak to those kind of concepts and what that looks like and what that means and how you put your own politics into your work. Maybe you can start with Doyle, because Doyle walked in with the coolest backpack. Yes, so he has buttons everywhere, so.
I mean, it's a massive question, so maybe I'll try to give an anecdote that I think speaks to that. I think as a white male person that it's helpful to allow yourself to try and make the effort, and also like make an ass out of yourself on occasion in trying to bring some positive change in this respect. So to the anecdote. So we were doing this project where we had all of these ringtones written for us, pieces that were of ringtone length that we recorded and then put out there. So we put together this list of like all these awesome composers, and then at some point before we were getting ready to dive in, we were like, oh my God, these are all white people. Okay, so we knew that we wanted George Lewis, who's an amazing composer. He's at Columbia University. We knew that he was already on the list, but we were like, he's the only person of color on this list. So it so happened that I was playing a show at Bowling Green State University, and he was the featured composer. And so I went up to him really sheepishly, and I was like, Mr. Lewis, so here's the deal. We have this project. We really want to invite composers of color, and I'm afraid that we've come up with like 5 or 6 names, and we just need more than that. And I don't know how to ask this question without being the white guy asking the stupid question of the black composer, but I'm going to anyway because I don't know any other way. And he was so amazing about it, and basically the gist of the story is that he said, if you want to affect positive change, you have to just go ahead and do it. So don't do this like stupid white liberal thing of like, oh, but I don't want to talk about it, or like no, you just go out there and you say, look, we need some diversity on this list of composers, and you do it, and you ask people, Anyway, I know it doesn't sound all that profound, but for me, it was like all of this nervousness that I had around it sort of disappeared for a second because I was sort of given dispensation to go out and just ask and be really, I guess, explicit in the ask. And that was a big learning experience for me. And also just in talk about like letting yourself be the idiot in the room. We were doing this Feldman second string quartet at MCA this year. So all of these resources and are getting poured into this, and we're playing at MCA, which we've been trying for like 5 years to get a date at MCA. And we were so wrapped up in this 6-hour-long piece in the project, we were having some of these same questions, like, look at all of this terribleness around us. Like, what does this concert have to do with anything? Like, okay, cool, this group is gonna play this 6-hour piece. I hope they make it, like, great. But if that's all we're offering at the end of the day, then it's just navel-gazing for fellow people that like weird music like that. And so we decided to do something really clunky, which is, what we're going to do? We're going to get a matching donation from one of our board members, and anybody that makes it all the way through, we're going to donate, I forget what the number was, $4,000 or $5,000, something like that, to, not Refugee One, who do we end up giving it to? Girl Forward, thank you. Which is a group that specifically targets refugee women in this country, targets, that was a terrible word, seeks to embolden and empower refugee women and especially young refugee women in this country. So it's a clunky way, right? It's sort of like, and we had that conversation, like, okay, people are gonna think it's tacked on or something, like, what does that have to do with Feldman? Or like, shouldn't it just be about the arts? But ultimately it felt way better to do that, and at the end of the day, like, send a really worthwhile organization $4,000 or $5,000, having done that concert because we had the spotlight on us for a few minutes, than to not do that. So that's my totally inarticulate answer to your question.
I'd like to, I'm not sure this is directly answering the question, but it does reference a couple of things you said before. The issue of, quote, diversity in symphony orchestras is a very big one, and it's one that for many decades, certain orchestras have tried to inaugurate programs and put in place programs to recruit, quote, minority people, minority musicians. The Detroit Symphony had a program in, what was that, the 70s that placed some but really very few, and then a couple of other orchestras started, and then it just sort of went nowhere in the 80s and 90s, and now some orchestras and the League of American Orchestra and the Mellon Foundation are looking at what can be done here, so there is more than one African-American man in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. But this relates to a way bigger societal issue that not just classical music can solve. I was asked actually a year or so ago by chairman of my department, why aren't there more African-Americans in the University Symphony? Well, one auditioned, Why aren't there more African Americans at the University of Chicago? We all think there should be, but it's not related to, it's related to societal issues of providing opportunities across the board in society and not having certain people privileged. In this city, for instance, we have the Merit Music Program that is able to identify and in some cases give wonderful opportunities to students and musicians from all parts of the city that might not otherwise have those opportunities. But that's just a drop in the bucket if you look at the whole society. And until society as a whole addresses poverty and privilege and opportunity and, people get instruments in their hands, it's going to be a long time before, you really see an orchestra that represents, shall we say, the cross-section of American society in terms of population. I hope we get to that day, but you can't just declare that it has to happen. So we need to be aware of the problems in society, do what we can, intersect in ways that Doyle's talking about, intersect in ways that we want to be, say, ambassadors for the meaningful experience of music and art, and bring that to all sorts of people everywhere, and on and on and on and on.
Barbara, how do you feel about the Chicago Sinfonietta?
Well, the Chicago Sinfonietta, of course, they have a wonderful mission that they are the, quote, the nation's most diverse orchestra. Two things: they're not as diverse as they used to be when they started, because they're not. And it's in part the pool of freelance musicians, and there are there are a lot of people that are that, for instance, play in my orchestra in Park Ridge that also play in the Sinfonietta. They're a group of freelance musicians. It's great on the one hand. It makes people aware of, I think, the issue of the fact that most orchestras are not diverse. But it's in a way it's also too bad that it has to be the calling card. I think that they do some really imaginative programs, and their programming in terms of the composers they feature and the types of music and the kind of multimedia projects and so forth that they present, to me that's more interesting than the fact that they have a more diverse population. That it's certainly worthy, it brings it to attention to people, so I endorse that mission, and I endorse their mission of creating, bringing wonderful programming. It's too bad that it has to be the one and only orchestra that is the nation's most diverse. We wish we had some more.
Because I think it's not only is it diverse in terms of who we see on stage and what's being programmed, and the fact that you might have jugglers come out at the beginning, or circus kids running down
Right.
or something with the journey through the universe. But the audience is the most diverse audience I've seen as well, and that for me is really striking.
Depending on where they play.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
they play in Naperville too, and that audience isn't diverse. So sorry, sorry. But they bring them to Naperville because they think that the people in Naperville should see a diverse orchestra. That's part of the mission. So so maybe that's helping to make progress too. That the people in Naperville, where the audience is not diverse, will see that classical musicians can be diverse, and that gradually their expectations for who should be on stage will change, and it'll all filter out. So, I hope.
May I share a small anecdote, or how are we doing on time?
No, take your time.
Okay. Yeah, I think this speaks quite well into this notion of intersectionality, because these problems never present themselves in isolation. Yeah, usually it's a conglomeration of couple different issues like race, gender, class, and especially like when it's something like symphony orchestra or classical music, class usually plays a big role. A couple months ago, I went to the symphony orchestra to see a concert, and I'm going to mention the name because the piece is public. You can go check it out. It's a piece by John Adams called Shahrazad 2. And this was, I think, a couple weeks after the first executive ban on, 7 countries. So at the same time, I was going to all these airport protests and stuff like this. Anyway, the piece it's like a 50-minute kind of tone poem with a violin soloist. It was performed by Leyla Josefovich. The program notes were extremely interesting. John Adams wrote that the piece kind of draws inspiration from the original story of the Shahrazad, like Rimsky-Korsakov, but also the 1001 Nights. And of course, this is a story of a woman telling a story every night to not get killed, essentially. And after giving this introduction, John Adams wrote, but of course, in our modern society, we are far away from bettering the situation. Women still have to still face, violence and things like that. And the piece has this overtone of like empowerment for women, like a very progressive idea. Then what happened was he gives all these examples of women in situations of demise from Middle East, so like Egypt, Iran. In Egypt, the famous woman in blue bra, and several instances. And then after this whole paragraph, there's like one fleeting sentence at the end where he says, of course, this violence towards women happens in the West, even in our university campuses too, and that's like the end of the program now. So I read this, and here's like a very seemingly progressive situation that's going on, viewed from an extremely wrong-headed perspective, in my opinion. And I sat through this piece, and piece finished like standing ovation, all this exuberance, and to me it was a very strange experience being there, because in a way, even though this is not explicitly said, there's this feeling that there's like we should talk to Middle Easterners and like tell them not to beat their wives or something like this. So I think this is a particular situation where, yes, on the one front it seems a very progressive point of view, but there are some other things that are missing or like not fulfilled as much.
Thank you. Okay, so I really want to open to audience questions. I want to throw in also you bring up a really good point. I think my friends and I, when we go to see concerts, sometimes it can be a very uncomfortable situation. I've been to Nutcracker every year of my life, and I watch white people in yellowface dancing to Chinese music, right? And I came to college and I played Dvorak's American, right? And I loved it. And it's also supposedly based on like native dances, right, or something like that. And so to think about the canon in the ways that it appropriates a lot of, a lot of non-white cultures, and a lot of times I think feels very terrible. It feels terrible, and I think it's an interesting thing to kind of love those kind of pieces and to love Dvorak, right, and to simultaneously hear the things that he's doing, and to know that he's evoking, right, like a body of color and a culture of color. Okay, so I want to open it up to the audience. Yes, how are we going to do this? Do you want, okay, just shout it out.
Okay.
Do you want a mic?
I can yell.
Okay.
Or I can yell into a mic.
So actually, this whole panel raised some interesting points, especially about like how society like talks about women in classical music. And about a week ago, I was reading criticisms of Wikipedia, and they actually used the example of the page for women in classical music as a really bad example, or a really glaring example of how like Wikipedia is predominantly edited by like young white dudes, and that's pretty much it. And so I actually took a look, and I looked at the women in classical music page, and they mention our friend Hildegard, they mention Nadia Boulanger, and Clara Schumann, and that's pretty much it.
Great.
And so, yeah, it's great, yeah. It's amazing. And so, my question, I guess, to people on the panel would be, like, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to make the change that I want to do. But I guess my question would be, what do you think that should consist of? Like, what? Because obviously, like, it's inherently limiting. Like, this, to go back to the canon, like, is there really a canon of women in classical music? But what should that sort of page look like?
Should be way more than a page. Let's put it that way. with as many subcategories. First of all, I suppose there's no men in classical music page. So just by the existence of a women in classical music page, that shows part of the problem, that it is a special category and that it is thought of as a special category, not absorbed into the whole of the art. And I mentioned before at the beginning that I look forward to the day that I'm just a conductor, not a woman conductor. I think it's a long way off. Stacy said she, would like to be a composer, not a woman composer. That's also a long way off. But all of those history books need to be revised. The past doesn't change, but history does, because it's the story of the past, and so we need to be proactive about telling that story. And it should have just as many subcategories and history and nuances as anything else. So, go ahead, start writing.
One place you might look at is the recent winners of the Pulitzer Prize, as well as women who have served in composers in residence positions in orchestras and opera companies around the country.
I can jump in. One of the things that Barbara mentioned and Doyle kind of was alluding to earlier, in post-colonial theory, I think the approach to thinking about something like a page on women in classical music is not to hide from the fact that there is no men in classical music page, and to be very open and honest about that, and to say there, right, that women are not recognized as part of the canon. That's why that this page exists, right? And here are the ways that we have to take into consideration the fact that, right, that we need to have something like this to exist in order just to recognize women. I think it's a really interesting idea, not only, right, to see history as something that is written and not something that is, right, natural or something that we can know already. And so to be really honest about the fact that we have to say these things, that we have to say, right, that this page exists, and this page didn't exist, or that the classical music composers page didn't have women on it, and to have that information there, and to say this is the way that our society is doing music right now.
You also might, there's a group called the International Alliance of Women in Music, or for Women in Music. I'm not sure which prepositions are in there. They started out, I have a feeling that some of these organizations sprung up because there was a lot of women that, before my generation, they didn't know how to go about getting on the page even. Like, how do you even get onto a concert series? So I think there was a different aim back and that's why it would be, I wish Marta was here to address this, to find out how difficult was it for her generation to even say, hey, I'm here, I exist. I feel like at least my generation and those younger than me have a fighting chance. You know, we're accepted. People don't come up to me and say, hey, you're a woman composer. They say, hey, you're a composer. So it's okay, we're making really good progress here. So I think for all the discussion we're having, I think things are not nearly as bad as they used to be. And I think that is nice to acknowledge. But you might go looking at things like International Alliance for Women in Music just to see, there's also a brass ensemble, an all-woman brass ensemble that plays at Midwest every year. I think they're called Monarch, the Monarch Brass, and just to try to get those included. But once again, with the same idea that it's not to exclude anyone else, it's just to raise awareness.
Thanks. Daniel, you talked about this briefly, and I wanted to open up this question really for anyone, but perhaps specifically Barbara, Stacy, and Clara. Your experiences growing up and having these experiences of misogyny in classical music. I mean, I think it's fair to say that. How has that informed your teaching then of your students who identify as female, if it has? Yeah, like how that passed and how what you have had to overcome and experience, if that's reaches some form of, if it's reflected in your teaching at all.
Well, I think in terms of my own experience, I feel that to the extent I have been able to overcome it, which I think I have, the obstacles of being, not having role models and not, having, an easy path in, is because I have concentrated on developing my craft, developing my art, and being fully and 100% committed to music making. And the competence, and hopefully extraordinary competence, has to be at the height of things. And there's of course the old saying that a woman has to do things twice as well in order to get the same advantages as a man, and that may be true, but that the first and foremost that I want to have that inspiration as the goal of developing one's talents and one's competence to the greatest degree. When I have had female conducting students, I have mostly in one-on-one situations had serious talks with them about what the obstacles are, rather than making it part of the curriculum. Perhaps I should make it part of the curriculum. I know, Ali, when you took my conducting course, what was it, 4 men? I guess we didn't, but you never asked, on the other hand. You guys never asked about the issue. So again, the model was not to ignore it, but to make the extraordinary competence be the goal. And then I have tried to help people understand what kind of obstacles might or will be out there, and help give them the tools to transcend them.
I think also one of the big pieces of advice I've given people is you're going to just have to develop a thicker skin. I'm open to criticism. I certainly am, constructive criticism for my works. But if it's criticism because I'm a female, I'm not open to that. So I let that bounce off me, if that happens. And that happened a lot when I was in school, and as I've gone along, that has definitely dropped off. But that's where I'm getting really frustrated at seeing that it's still happening to some of the younger generations. So if you can develop that tougher skin, the other thing is to, hopefully we'll get to a point where you don't have to do this, but it does help to blend in a little bit. And what I mean by that is I learned how to drink beer and watch football and talk about football. And I'm not kidding, I love porters and stouts now as a result. And chocolate. But my point is that if I can talk the language of the male composers and the male conductors or performers, then I can get them into a conversation where we can then open it up and talk about other things that are of importance to us. So it becomes, being able to blend in a bit and adapt becomes a way to get other conversations started that are important to me.
Just a quick little anecdote that I was asked once by a search committee whether I played golf and whether I could play golf with the donors to the orchestra, because that was a big, a big plus for getting the job, which I didn't get. because I don't play golf and never will.
I think for me as a performer, teaching performance, I think gender enters into the equation in perhaps smaller and more nuanced ways than if I were teaching composition or conducting. I think, I feel lucky, or I recognize that it is a lucky thing anyway, that women performers are very accepted now in almost all spheres of music making. But I will say that if, in particular, if a student is asking me about playing more new music, or there's an opportunity to introduce new music to a student, I will go out of my way to try to make that introduction a female composer. Or even if I am trying to think of a great recording for a student to listen to, or a YouTube video of a piece of music, I will try, if my student is female, I will try to think of a recording or a video in which the performer is also female, because I think it subtly reinforces the idea that you, this student, can be doing all of these things, but also, like I said, I think it's important to try to see more people who look like you doing what it is that you want to be doing.
To ask a perhaps overly broad question, it seems like a lot of what you've been getting at is that classical music, more than any other genre, is really associated with like being for and by a very particular set of people, and also I still don't really understand this, but very stuck in the past. And there's a certain expectation of what classical music is, I think, more than any other genre. So how do you think we get out of that, or if we'll ever get out of that? And do you think that like aspects of identity will be like helpful or hinder the sort of progress towards like classical music as a more living thing in general? Because of course there's like the new music scene, but to me, at least from the outside, it seems like there's a big distinction between like the established institutions that, you know, your average person might go to, oh, they're playing Beethoven's Ninth. Like, I know what that is, versus the new music world, which is perhaps more diverse, but also much more niche. So will there ever be a merging of those?
I hope so. I think that a lot of the bigger cultural institutions are recognizing that at least these are important issues to be talked about, even if they're not talking about them in the most progressive or productive ways. So I think the climate is starting to change. When you were saying your question, however, it did make me think of something that we haven't talked about yet today, and I'll just say it as a sort of very small point, but in those bigger established institutions, so for example, if you're going to go see Beethoven 9 at CSO, what are the women in the orchestra wearing? I recalled during your question that when I was at Juilliard in 2004 or 5, it was the first time that, that the symphony orchestra had a dress code, and it was the first time that women were allowed to wear pants at all as a member of that orchestra. So even something so simple as that, I think, can really say a great deal about our traditions.
If I can add something to this, which will be, what I will say will sound very pessimistic, but I think it is actually a hopeful comment. You know, I don't really think the gender problem in classical music can or will be solved, or race problem. I think this problem is one that will be always present. Certainly there are improvements, and there hopefully will be more improvements, but I think by definition, the canon, classical music, whatever you want to call it, it is what it is. But one thing that maybe this perpetuation allows us or affords us to do is to retain a critical perspective towards the canon itself. So a lot of our discussion sort of centered around the notion of inclusion or like diversifying the canon or repertoire, which is, I think, a very useful and important thing to do. But there is also, I think we must also retain the critical horizon and like really ask ourselves, what is the alternative to thinking about music making that is not canonic? You know, what if for especially like women composers, or you know, from other racial backgrounds, so on and so forth, maybe composition or like music making in the more classical music canonical sense is not the only answer. So that might afford us a position from which we can actually think critically about all these institutions and positions afforded by classical music, I think.
I think the question is pretty complicated a lot because of looking at programmatic needs, like presenters' needs or the CSO's needs. Who is buying those tickets, and what are they coming to hear? What is the repertoire they want to hear that's going to sell the tickets? So I think we do have to look around the other groups and other people that are outside of that. Someone like Laurie Anderson, who's had a very long career and successful career of touring and doing her own shows. Pamela Z is another. Meredith Monk is a third. For me, Kronos Quartet would probably be the height of, they've been around for what, 40 years now? And they're still innovating. They're still figuring out, like they're doing the 50 for the Future program right now, and 10 composers a year, 5 women, 5 men each year, and they're writing repertoire that will be played by younger string quartets. So they are still innovating. I think that's where we need to look, is who are those groups that are welcoming people from the non-standard into the canon, and seeing what can we do to promote those groups and create more of those groups. Eighth Blackbird is doing a wonderful creative, I think it's called Creative Lab, am I right? This is the first summer it's happening. 30 musicians and composers are coming together, and let's see what they do. This could be a new wave of something that's that will help change the face of how we know classical music.
Well, thank you all so much. So I have a question going back to the topic of pedagogy and role models and that sort of thing. So one thing I was thinking about is there's a book that's been very powerful for me. I feel a little self-conscious about it because I think it's a kind of self-helpy book, but it's called Playing Big by Tara Moore. And so this is a book specifically about the psychological barriers faced by women professionally that are often ingrained in centuries-old issues. And she has a whole chapter, for example, on perfectionism, and also a whole chapter on likability, this sort of compulsion felt by many women to be likable, and putting that as a central priority. And then it made me wonder whether there's the possibility that pedagogy could ease some of these, whether there are certain methods that could ease some of these issues by, for example, I was thinking about, Barbara mentioned she went to Smith, and I think they have a workshop now called Failing Well. And if there are sort of methods that can encourage, in the case of, bringing more women into the world of composition, encouraging experimenting and possibly failing, encouraging basically discouraging risk-averse behavior by making it okay to fail and making that a learning experience, and sort of decreasing this drive towards perfectionism. And then for performers, of course, encouraging a little bit healthier relationship with that perfection that is required of classical music as a practice. I just wondering if you've seen any pedagogical techniques emerging, or if you could envision something to kind of help solve this problem maybe from the bottom up.
Sounds like I should read the book and maybe incorporate it.
I think in some ways it's something that's endemic to classical music, sort of capital C classical music. is this sort of fetishization of genius, which kind of gets at the perfectionism thing that you're talking about. And so there's a little bit of a roundabout answer to what you're saying, but to me, I think the people that most of us look up to and that are really successful, it comes down to extremely hard work and getting opportunities rather than some sort of innate magical something that they have that other people don't have. So to me, for what you're talking about, like, okay, the most tone-deaf thing I hear about, say, diversifying programming is, well, there's just this dearth of scores by, you know, good pieces by women composers. Like, that's the dumbest thing that I hear. But unfortunately, you hear it, you know, more often than I'd like to. And that's A, of all stupid, and B, of all just, you know, just completely, it just shows a complete lack of any kind of like having dug into what's available. But really, actually, let me come at this a slightly different way. Stacey, throw a bottle of water at me if you don't want me to tell this story. But if you don't mind my sharing, Stacey, when she walked in the room, mentioned to Barbara that one of her first orchestral pieces was workshopped and performed here, right? And that she had a learning experience about a part of the music that didn't work. And for most composers, again, throw that bottle of water at me if I'm saying the wrong thing, but for, I think, most composers, that learning can only happen sort of when those opportunities to get your piece performed are happening. And that's how you become a better composer. And so for us, at least, as people that program or choose our programming in music, I think offering those opportunities where we can is really where the pedagogy is going to happen, because like having that experience of figuring out what's working and what's not working in your music, it sometimes or a lot of times can only happen on stage or only happen through that process of workshopping.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I don't want that piece to ever see the light of day again, but it really was so beneficial to have heard it, and that was the first time I tried anything out, and to realize, wow, that part was brilliant, and that part really sucked. You know, it's like back to back, and I really, you know, I had a lot to learn. It was cut out for me. The problems though you're addressing, though, I don't feel are female specific. Yeah, I've had so many students over the last 17 years that always compare themselves to final scores. You know, how do you win when you compare yourself to Boulez, who's in his 50s or 60s when he wrote this thing, or Elliott Carter, or, you know, any other host of people? And so there's many things I came up with to solve that. One of them was I got early Carter scores and early George Crumb scores in our library, so that when the tiers would begin in lessons, I would send them to the library, check out these scores. Do you see any evidence of Carter? Do you see any evidence of Crumb? No? Well, then why are you expecting so much of yourself right now? I don't know. You know, just like, so there's certain things you can do to overcome those problems. I think, though, that's what I'm saying, they're not gender specific. I think maybe women have more of a tendency to think that something can be perfect, but regardless, another strategy I always use, and I use it myself, is to try to be less subjective. Try to be as objective as we can as we go about doing our craft. So if someone comes up to a problem spot, okay, you're not sure where to go, it feels a little weird, rewrite it 2 more times. Now, as a scientist, look at all 3 options and see which offer the best solutions, maybe part of this and part of that. And so the more you can get objective about the process, the less it feels like it has to be perfect that first time around.
There's like one more question.
Ooh, it better be good.
Thank you so much for taking my question. Doyle, earlier you mentioned something, paraphrasing your wife, I think you said, your programming is your mission statement. Can the other panelists, I guess, and specifically Barbara, or anyone else who programs concerts, respond to that, maybe elaborate, are you against it, and how your mission statement interacts, of course, with your performers and your audiences, and how your audiences are maybe spending their money, and that's been in the conversation earlier as well.
Well, just quickly, I agree with it wholeheartedly, and I have, as an orchestral conductor there are actually 3 different orchestras that I conduct. I try very hard not to just do the familiar war horses, but always to introduce something unusual, to introduce as much new music as the audience will tolerate, and that may sound like a bit of a cop-out or a compromise, but as much as can be. And I do think that has had some effect on audiences and on musicians. Certainly, I've had other conductors either my peers or people older than I am who have said, "Oh, I'm so envious. I never got a chance to conduct that piece," or "I've never heard that piece. What are you doing conducting that?" So I know that my own repertoire has been way broader than many people, and I do think that that has an impact. Also, referring to something that Stacy said, yes, the CSO does have to sell tickets, but I think if they were a little more adventurous with their programming, it would be easier for everybody else, because by not being adventurous, not only the CSO but the big five orchestras, all they do is reinforce that very narrow, quote, canon of repertoire. And they're the ones that have perhaps the institutional fortitude that they could take more of a risk than they do. And they could, if they were doing more to broaden the horizons for listeners, I think we would be in a better state than we are now. So I think my mission statement is who I am. I think, probably for everybody up here, but I also think for the CSO and the New York Phil and so forth, it holds very true.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're gonna stop there. So thank you to our panelists.